Hi, you're listening to Status Stranded Arena Allie by David Halem. I hope you enjoy. Bridget had lent me her armor. She isn't able to use it, and soon enough it won't even fit her. I had my serrated claymore at my side as I walked into the light. My heart was thundering in my chest so hard I could feel it throbbing against my temples. Every once in a while, my vision would distort slightly from how hard my heart was beating. We were all told that we don't feel a second of time as we walk into the lights that will put us on the battlefield. As three of us walked into the lights, we wished each other luck. Varney and I wished the most luck to Gregor, and I wished as much luck to Varney. All I know is this. If I walk into a fight, these two men had died. I hope this isn't the last time I get to see their faces alive. Gregor and Varney slightly tapped their weapons before the three of us walked into the lights in front of us. The way the light was, it didn't blind me like walking into any other bright light. My eyes didn't need to adjust as I walked through the light and into the battle arena. The first thing I saw was a shock of almost paralyzing surprise. Rain's mother was 15 feet away from me, staring me down. Her eyes narrowed as she bolted towards me with her black and green short sword in hand. She screamed, and it was a feral sound, no cognitive human emotion whatsoever. I summoned my claymore in a panic. I needed a short moment to take this in. I hit Rain's mother with the broadside of my blade, more to bludgeon her than to cut her. I pushed and knocked her backwards a few steps. The sword she held in her hand was chipped badly like glass or brittle pottery. We both stared at each other with foul emotions tainting our perceptions. Dozens of nightmares flaunted through my mind's eye that all circled around her. As clear as day, I could see Rain knelt in front of her, facing me, waiting to be killed by his own mother. I made the mistake of blinking, and Rain was dead on the ground, face unrecognizable as the broken shards of her sword were protruding from his pale and mutilated flesh. I winced at the sight and wasn't ready for what came next. Rain coughed on the ground, sputters of blood gurgling out of his throat as he wheezed for breath. I screamed and swung my massive blade against his mother. She jumped back wide-eyed, avoiding the wide swing of the blade. She sidestepped more favorably than walking backwards. She was stepping smoothly and quickly towards my right, but I kept my focus on her. She crouched down to eye level with me, and her glower almost drilled holes into my skull. I followed her, quickly making wide turns around her to ensure that she was still in a defensive position. I raised my blade again and swung at her backhanded, but I put more forward movement into the swing by lunging forward against her. She tactically dropped to the ground and rolled towards me as I swung the blade. I tried to jump out of the way or over her to dodge whatever attack she would inflict on me, but I wasn't fast enough. She cut against my shins. Even though there was armor protecting them, I could still feel the hit as hard as being stabbed. The blade made an ear-splitting cracking noise on impact with my shins, and I groaned in reaction. My legs weren't bleeding, but there were sharp pains shooting through my legs from the impact. I made myself fall as on top of her as hard as I could. I landed on her side. I didn't make a dent in her with that alone. The claymore was too big right now to do any substantial attacks against her. I dismissed the blade and used the handle to hit her in the head as hard as I could, but I was in an awkward position for that attack. I got nowhere. She got her bearings and swung her sword against me. The sword was at its full length again as she tried to hit its mark, my arm. The fabric of the jacket tore at the stress the blade ensued. I gripped my teeth in pain as the blade shredded through and a few shards of her blade cut into and embedded into my arm. I growled in pain as I turned and twisted my body to try to kick her in the face. I nailed her in the jaw, and the only sound I could hear from her body was the bump of the impact. We separated, and I made sure that my claymore was in hand. I was tense from the cut against my arm, and I could still feel the glass that was still in my arm. At least the cut was on my right arm. The sting of the cut was slowly starting to go away as my arm started to mend myself around the glass. I summoned my blade as she stood up again, and without hesitation slashed the blade laterally against her. The blade grinded against her chainmail skirt and pushed her more than cut her. I was disappointed to not see any blood coming from the attack. If she had dodged the attack, she would have been running towards me, but since she was hit at all, she was resetting her footing. I took a few deep breaths as the last of the stinging was starting to fade, but the glass-like shards were still uncomfortable in my arm. I lunged forward and brought the claymore upwards against her, hoping to either wreck her armor more or draw any amount of blood. The blade grinded against the chainmail, but at the angle I hit her, I cut off her left hand at the middle of the forearm. She roared in pain, an almost inhuman sound coming from her. She grit her teeth as she shook her head. She put her bleeding stub behind her back as she approached me with more fury and anger than before. I held my blade like a shield and pushed against her as she charged me. I made the mistake of blinking on impact. Rain's mother and I collided, and the impact shook me more than I thought it would. I felt like I got shot in the stomach again. The screaming pain was as loud as an endless explosion that grew louder and louder as long as his mother was here. I screamed as I saw the same image over and over again, his mother shooting him in the head. Another shot and my dad was limp on the ground, consumed in flames. Another shot and Rain was dead on the ground. I was lost in a hang time of disbelief. I shook my head violently to tear and rip the images out of my mind. I screamed and my voice cracked and grew hoarse as I screamed. The image of my burning dad with Rain's gunshot dead body draped over him was slammed into my head, and I screamed even louder in shock and horror. I opened my eyes and the stinging air was refreshing in contrast to the burning images that were creating deep scars and ravines in my heart and soul. Time felt like it was de-escalating. His mother hardly moved as she stared at me, breathing almost in slow motion. I put my claymore in position to attack as I made the first running steps forward to attack her. Every motion was lethargic, like moving through boiling hot water. My head hurt. A few slow steps forward and I tripped on something, or someone. Varney's dead, blood-drenched body hardly budged as my feet were caught on him. I chanced to look down at him and his face was unrecognizable. I could only tell who it was by the armor, but his armor did nothing to protect his face. There were broken pieces of Rain's mother's sword jutting out of his mouth and making bulges in his neck that threatened to break out and expose themselves at the first suggestion of force. I looked back up at Rain's mother, who was now charging me at this glacial speed that I'm perceiving everything in, this painful slowness that I was entranced inside. I dismissed my blade and used both of my arms to catch myself and roll with the fall that I had tripped into. On impact with the ground, my right arm jolted with pain from the glass that was embedded into my flesh. I felt like I grunted, but the echoes off the walls resounded in a screaming grunt. I made the full motion of rolling forward, and it was enough to make the final motions to stand up, but the lesser gravity threw me off balance enough to where I stumbled onto my knees. I made the mistake of looking up. His mother was already in final inches of hitting me across the face with the broadside of her glass-like blade. The initial hit hammered my right cheekbone like a kick, but in my foolishness, I resisted the follow-through, making the strike hit harder than it should have. The sword shattered, and thumb-sized shards of her blade scraped, scratched, and dug deep lacerations into my face. The pain burned, and my glistening blood sprayed out in gobs and mists. At point blank, I was almost visually impaired by the glowing of my own blood as it dominated my vision. I made myself follow through the hit, thrusting my head to the side. I scrambled to my feet and wiped away as much of the blood from my eyes as I could with my hand. I winced as wide strips of my skin moved in ways it shouldn't have as I wiped my eyes. My eyes burned from my blood still residing in the cavity between my eyes and the rest of my head. I growled and grunted from the pain. The lacerations against my face were starting to stitch together slowly. My vision was blurred and tinted an orange color. And in inconsistent places of my vision, there were massive distortions. The ground looked lower, that part of space looked wider. I was disoriented. His mother was still running at me from what I could see as I turned around. She raised her sword to hit it against me in a slashing motion. I dashed forward to shoulder check her before she could swing it against me. The blade shattered against my left shoulder. The bruising impact knocked me slightly off kilter for a half a second. The fragments of the sword stuck itself into my right hand between my thumb and first finger, the single shard almost going through the whole thickness of my hand. The pain of this fragment was as bad as stepping on a nail, and the nail went all the way through the foot. The painful noise that escaped my gritted teeth graveled against my abused throat. I pulled the shard of glass out of my hand as fast as I could. The pain of the blade leaving my hand was comparable to removing that same nail as before, and my golden blood lingered on the shard as I threw it to the ground. I think there's still a piece of glass in my hand. My right hand was shaking in pain, but I could feel my flesh already pulling itself together at my hand. The lacerations on my face had now mostly healed up, but there was still the radiant blood from earlier rolling off my face like tears or sweat. With both hands, I held the handle of my claymore and summoned the blade. She was mere inches to my right, and I looked up at her stiff, fixed face. It didn't look like there was a spark of joy or fear in her eyes as I swung my blade against her stomach from my side. The slicing motion grinded and tore against the chainmail before there was a massive lateral crevice in her midsection. The grinding noise slowed significantly as armor gave a wide berth to her soft flesh. Instead of letting the swinging attack follow through, I pushed into the attack, pushing the claymore deeper into her stomach, pushing her back hard. A resounding cry of pain and anger erupted from her mouth as I pressed in. The sound of the blade roving over her spine vibrated the blade. With the farther tip of the claymore, I slammed Rain's mother the last 3 feet to the ground before I dismissed my blade, all the blood and pulp dropping to the ground. Blood pooled out from her stomach like a bleeding spring. My mind was wrung out and exhausted as I stepped the few feet forward to stand over her. I didn't have the peace of mind to simply speak it, so I screamed, "Say something!" I swore before I screamed again, "Just say something!" She didn't look like she understood a word I said, but she was sprawling to try to get any amount of grounding as her obliterated intestines bled out. I was disappointed as I hoarsely roared the last words she would ever hear. "You monster!" Those words shot up in my spine and rattled my mind, and the echo of screaming them. Everything felt different. My breaths were fast and hardly calculated as I resummoned my claymore and thrust the front point down onto her face, off-center. This final blow put an asymmetric, bleeding line close to the middle of her face. Her nose was on her right half, but there were more teeth on the left side. That as if they weren't shattered from my blow. I killed her. I dropped to my knees, and not even a second later the deep resounding bell tone echoed through the arena. I was shaking. In front of me was my fiancé's insane mother, dead because I killed her, for the insurance of amnesty of an entire planet. My claymore was still in my handle in my hand, and almost the whole of the blade was resting on the ground, covered in crimson blood. I dismissed the blade, and the blood on the blade dropped to the ground. And without the support of the blade, the handle dropped out of my hand. Tears started to well up in my eyes, and my heart pounded like someone was hitting me with a massive stone over and over again in the chest. The pointed shards of the blade were still in my forearm and hand, and they may be some small pieces still in my face. Someone sprinted towards me and grabbed me. I screamed but was cut short. Hey, it's me, Allie," Rain said softly with his own quivers in his voice. "It's done, you won, honey." He held me gently with my blood-covered face, leaving a bloody print on his jacket. Mr. Rain, the living Javiero, was translated as he was close by. I could feel the energy go dark from within Rain as he heard the world leader's voice. "I don't even want to look at the bastard," he said with a hush to his voice. "I see." Javiero paused. "Scum loves pretty scum. Typical." It sounded like he sighed before continuing. "As promised, Brecton is yours." Rain let out a shaking sigh before he spoke. "And what about you?" He swore. There was a cold pause before the world leader spoke again. "I can do whatever I please, but I am just as good as dead." "Because of your clones?" Rain's voice was rough. There was another short pause. "Partially. My last fighter is as good as dead as well, alike reasons." I was startled at what he had said, and everything in my mind seemed to shut down. My eyes didn't register any sight. My ears didn't hear a sound. My skin felt no pain or sensation. Nothing felt dark. There was no light or color. All I felt was the overwhelming lack of information. If I could feel my body, my heart would be thundering in my chest, pounding so hard it would abuse my ribcage. If I could see, my vision would be distorted even more by my tears. If I could hear, I don't know what I would be hearing. I could be hearing how much Rain loves me by his own voice. I could be hearing Slainie tell another story. I could be hearing anything that would go with the experience that I was living at the moment. But there seemed to be nothing to register. That I felt something, everywhere. It felt like I was buried, not in dirt, but in sand. The strange feeling of my eyes not being there didn't line up with the reality of the fact that I could still see. I didn't know how I could see without eyes. The sand felt cold on my skin. I tried to turn my head to look around in the sand, but all I could see was sand. There was a rumbling coming towards me. Then I felt a push. I was pushed deeper into the sand by something, but I don't know what. I was blinded and made senseless again. I hadn't opened my eyes. I was just able to see again. My eyes have been healed mostly now. There were only a small distortion in my vision now. Rain was holding me in his arms bridal style, my head closer to his chest, and I could hear his heart rhythmically exploding. I stirred, and he held me closer to him as he walked. He walked down a flight of stairs, and someone opened a door for us. We were in our room now. He placed me gently on my bed. I was shaking so much that the springs of my bed were creaking. Rain's footsteps quickly paced back and forth before he made a sound, and that sound was a painful scream.
Hi, this is David Halen, and you just finished listening to Arena Allie from my story, Status Stranded. I hope you enjoyed. See you next week.